So, welcome everybody to our first Iowa OER webinar of this semester. These are sessions that we try to hold semi-regularly, at least twice a semester, sometimes more, on topics related to OER, open ed, open pedagogy, and other adjacent topics that might be of interest, both in Iowa and beyond. So if you have topics that are of interest to you that you'd like to see covered, you can always send us a message through the Iowa OER Google group. And I put a link to that group in the chat. I would recommend signing up for it to get all sorts of updates about OER in the state. And I also put links to our Iowa OER Action Team website and our YouTube archive too. So feel free to check any of that out at any point. Today, we're joined by two guests, Carly Manz and Andrew Hosmanek, both Iowa authors who have developed OER remixes. So Carly Manz is a teaching professor in the Department of Genetics, Development, and Cell Biology at Iowa State. She teaches introductory level anatomy and biology lecture courses and is the course director of the large multi-section lab courses that accompany these lectures. Recently, she's published OER lab manuals for both the Fundamentals of Human Anatomy and Principles of Biology 2 lab courses. And Andrew Hosmanek is a professor of instruction in the Management and Entrepreneurship Department at the Tippie College of Business at University of Iowa. He holds both a PhD and JD from the University of Iowa as well. And he teaches courses in business law, ethics, and negotiations. So Andy created an OER remix called Business Law, Ethics, and Sustainability, which he uses for undergraduate law courses. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to just type them into the chat, or you can save them for the end. We'll try to save about 20 minutes at the end of this for discussion. So now I'll turn it over to Carly, who will go first, and then she can hand it over to Andy.
Okay, thank you. So I will hopefully successfully share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay. All right, so thank you so much for having me. So I have recently published as by myself or as a team for the two lab courses that I oversee, lab manuals. And they were both kind of different projects. So one of them was a lab manual for the anatomy course that I've kind of put up here. I've got the overall learning objectives for that anatomy course, and then the topics and activities that have been the schedule for that course for before I even started at Iowa State, and then when I took over about 10 years ago. It worked pretty well. So it was a good schedule. The issue was that we had a lab manual that was by a for-profit publisher. It was pretty expensive. It was like $80 per student. And they kind of came at us a few years ago saying that they wanted to move it all digitally. And for a lab manual, that's pretty hard to do in a science setting. When you're in the lab room, you don't want to have like your laptops out and doing all that. So we wanted to move to an OER lab manual that would accompany the lab course. And we already had kind of the schedule in place, and we had our activities that we wanted to do. And so we had a framework to work off of, which was nice because we weren't changing that. We just wanted to come up with a new lab manual that could support the course. So it's a pretty large lab course. There's I think 3 in-person lecture sections and then usually about 20 lab sections that run per semester. And so we needed to be able to have a manual that would work for everybody. And then the other thing about this course is that the lecture and lab usually are taken concurrently, but not always. So sometimes they take the lecture in a different semester and then they take the lab later on. And so we couldn't assume that they would have their textbook from the lecture course. So we needed to have enough content in the lab manual for them to be able to, reference and look at all of that. So those were kind of all the constraints that we had in place and that we could kind of build off of to create the OER lab manual for the course. So in order to do that, I worked with the ISU OER librarian, Abby Elder, who is so fantastic. I cannot say enough good things about her. She was incredibly helpful. She held my hand through the whole process. Um, and so the first thing that she said that I should do is come up with this alignment table. And you can see this, right? The Excel. Okay, great. Um, so so basically she put this together for me where she just had the different topics that we wanted to do each week. And then she also came up with the kind of the key words that you'd find within those topics, within our learning objectives for each week. And then she gave me a lot of different possibilities of OER to look at for anatomy and physiology for different courses. There was some medical terminology courses she found. There was a bunch of different anatomy lectures, anatomy labs, and then also it's you either do anatomy and physiology in separate semesters or you do a combined A and P course. And so there's also a lot of different OER that was A and P combined. And so there's many different options. And so she said, look through them all, figure out what works best for you, and then you can remix if you like some stuff from some and some from the other. And I was looking through all of those, and there was just a really huge range of like how comprehensive each thing was, if it fit our course, just anatomy, or if there was a bunch of physiology thrown in. Um, there was some chapters where it made a lot of sense to match up to a course that, somebody had already made an OER for. And then there was other times when they just really diverged and we wanted to do one thing differently. So it made sense to remix and kind of look through just the different sources and then go chapter by chapter. So for each chapter, go through, find the OER that would fit well for it, and dividing it up by subtopic. So if we have a certain number of learning objectives, even just picking an OER source that matched, each individual learning objective, was what I ended up doing for the chapters. So you can see like chapter 1, I could pretty much just use one OER source and just pretty straight imported that. But there were other weeks where, so like week 10 was one where I used 3 different OER sources, and then I also ended up writing part of it as well, just because what worked for our course didn't fit perfectly with an OER that I found. So that was really helpful to have that organizational structure. And then from there, what I ended up doing was I had even more files. So I think the main takeaway from this is like the more organized you are, the better. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself crazy. But I'm just going to show you. So week 10 was kind of a tough one for needing a lot of different things to kind of all throw together within one chapter. That's on the blood and the heart. So I'll show you the different files I used. So first off, I had kind of my text import file. So for each chapter, I had one of these, and I would give it to Abby, our OER librarian at ISU, and she did all the work of putting it into Pressbooks once I told her what I wanted, which again was very nice. So I'd have the learning objectives for that week, which our course wrote these and have been using for years. So we start with the learning objectives, and then I would just sort of line up, which OER I wanted for each subtopic and in what order. So I had my kind of shorthand code for the OER, the chapter, link to it. And then I had notes to myself for like once it was imported, what did I need to delete? What did I need to edit? Because by the time it was imported, I'd forget those things if I didn't write them down. So, do that for one OER, and then for the heart, a later subtopic of that chapter, I'd have a different OER I'd identify, different links. Um, Sometimes the figures weren't the best matches for what we were hoping for the lab. So we'd also find, figures from a different OER source or like Wikimedia Commons, things like that. And so I'd make notes about when we'd use different figures to put within the text. And so I'd do that, kind of line up in what order each section should be imported into Pressbooks. And then some things I had to write on my own because just the OER sources didn't fit exactly what I was hoping for. So I'd also put in, just straight put in this text. And so this chapter is really kind of a big amalgamation of different things. But I'd send this chapter to our librarian and she would put in all this text from the OER. And then the figures were kind of a whole separate thing. So I had a different file for the figures. So that'd be an Excel file. And this was also very important because once you start putting in different figures from different sources, but then you reference the figures in the text, you really need to know like what is 10.1. So I had this file where I'd say, each figure, what's the identifier, what the title of it was, which OER source it came from, the link, and then the caption, just in case the import didn't work out very well. I think I also had a file maybe that had alt text as well, because sometimes you'd have to double check the alt text. So for each chapter, I had the Word doc of text, and then I had this Excel file of figures to double check that we got all the right figures in. And we deleted all the figures that we didn't want from, the various OER sources that got imported. And then also tables. So make sure that we insert the right tables, relabel those. And so that was kind of the organizational structure. I'd send those files to our librarian, and then she would import it into Pressbooks. And then once that was done, I'd go into Pressbooks and I'd do all kind of the final editing, go back to my notes about what needs to be deleted or changed and make sure that that all looks good, double check all the figures, make sure they're labeled correctly and all of that. And so that's kind of the process that we did that, and we just went chapter by chapter. And then what we ended up with, so this is the lab manual. We published it through the ISU Digital Press. And so this was great because the lab manual is sort of in two parts. There's sort of the larger reference text, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we can't assume that a student enrolled in the course this semester is also taking the lab at the same time. And so we wanted to have, enough reference for them to go into it and look at it. And so that we wanted to stay virtual because that was all reference kind of to look at outside of lab and to help prepare for lab. And so those sections could be kind of big. And it's essentially like enough for a textbook. But we tried to cut out all the really extraneous information. So this was available to all the students virtually. And we had links to it within our LMS. We use Canvas. And so each chapter would have a direct link. And so you can open the chapter in Canvas to look at, and they can study before or after class. So this was the virtual part. And then we also had the printed activity book part. And so this is the PDF of it, but we made sure that we have the bookstore printed out, and then all the students get a copy. So this is what they have in lab, and it has like the instructions for how to do the dissections. It has all the questions that they can write the answers for. So this is kind of like the bare bones, what they need to have in class to fill out. And because it's printed, it does cost them something. It's about $16, I think, just to kind of have the printout. Um, but all the virtual reference material that is linked through Canvas, that was kind of the free OER part. Um, so that's kind of the form that we had the textbook published in. So we have, just checking my notes to make sure I go through everything. Um, yeah, and then I just show you kind of the last thing I wanted to show you. So in Canvas, we have it organized, by week, and we have our link to our virtual lab manual, right? So if we click on this, that opens up that chapter of the virtual material. It's taking forever, but yeah, so it's within the LMS, so that's nice. The students don't have to go try to find it somewhere. Um, and then the one other thing that was nice to do, because we had the OER images, the images that we could pretty freely manipulate, is within the text, we would, where am I? Yeah. So we'd have all these reference figures for them to look at, and then to actually try to make them read the text before they came to lab to be prepared. We could manipulate these figures, and we ended up creating, sorry, my Zoom bars above. Okay. We ended up making these kind of manipulated figures where they'd be the exact figures from the lab manual, but then we'd take out all the labels and we'd put in the numbers. And so then we'd say, if you want to be able to do this, open up your lab manual, find the right figure, and match it. And so at least that would create an obligation to engage with the material before lab. And so these pre-lab figures, I think, are another thing that we're going to try to put up as supplementary material for the lab manual so that other instructors can use them as well. And I think that is the main things I wanted to show you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carly.
Thank you.
All right, now let's turn it over to Andy.
Right. Can you guys hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, I'm Andy Hosmanek. I teach here at the College of Business, University of Iowa, and I teach a massive lecture course. So my Intro to Law course is required for all business students. They usually take it in their sophomore year. And we've had enrollments that have grown from 400, I think, when I started, to well over 800 a semester now. When I started, we had three different professors working on this, and then one retired and one moved into administration. So I've kind of shouldered this large class. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of logistical issues with a class that big. One of those became a big problem for me a couple of years in. So we had used kind of a standard off-the-shelf textbook for many years. And then in an effort to save students money, I had co-authored a book with the two other professors in the class. And we distributed that actually through a local bookstore. It was a PDF, but we sold it in a printed form for about $40. And it was a pretty good book. But then one of the authors retired, and he was not amenable to continuing to edit it or change it in any way. And law changes as the Supreme Court makes decisions. So we needed some updates. He was also really resistant to distributing it electronically, because when he was retired, he could then get royalties off of the printed book, and he didn't want to give up those royalties. He also would only let us distribute it through one non-university bookstore, and they just decided one day they would not ship the book overseas, which was a huge problem because we had a massive online section with a lot of students who were overseas in the military or other places. So I was basically in this position of I'm stuck, my book doesn't work. I can go off the shelf and get kind of the leading business law textbook, and that was selling for about $360. And it was in maybe the 20th edition. So they released new editions. It has almost no resale value. A lot of our students struggle financially. Um, I just couldn't see asking them to lay out that kind of money for a book that they're going to use once and then not be able to resell. So at the same time, I think I got an email about these OERs and started hearing about these. And I thought, now that sounds kind of neat. And then there was a program at Iowa called the Open Hawks OER Grant, where there was a little, well, actually a good amount of money available to develop OERs. And so I'm going to share my screen here and show you what we came up with. So hopefully everyone can see the screen here with the purple book. All right. Um, so I started looking around and thinking about the possibilities of either writing a new book from scratch, which seemed really daunting, or maybe using someone else's OER as a way to kind of fill the gap. And actually did that for a year. I found a really good book by Professor Jeff Lingwall that was called Business Law from a Risk Management Perspective. And he's a professor out in Utah, and he remixed another OER for his business law classes, and it was very good. But he was teaching more toward the risk management and finance side of law, whereas my course is a true survey course with environmental law, with criminal law, with constitutional law, all these other things. And so I asked his permission to explore remixing the book, and he said sure. And he had the proper Creative Commons license to do that. And so we applied for an Open Hawks grant and we got funded. And I was able to hire a wonderful research assistant from the law school here, Brendan Smith. He was number one in his class and a wonderful person to work with. And this was around 2021, I think we were working on this. So we were all still, at least I was still working from home. And this was a nice little virtual project for us to dig into. So we took the source book and kind of mapped it out to our coverage. And in my course, we have 15 different modules in Icon that ranges from, intro to the course, the court system, torts, contracts, etc., up through employment law. And so the first thing was to see like, where does one map onto the other? Next, there was also getting the OER we had into the Pressbooks format because I really was excited about this format more than just distributing a PDF because of all the interactive things that we could do with that. And so Brendan was just really, really great. He had really good technical skills as far as kind of formatting things and making them, look really nice. And then my co-author and co-teacher and good friend, Michael Dayton, who's a full-time attorney, he came in to contribute some really rich content to this that you don't find in other books. So, just to give you an idea of, I guess, what a chapter would look like here, if we just kind of pull up, I don't know, courts in the legal process. We've got our learning objectives at the top. So we aligned our course learning objectives with what we present and we wrote new ones. And all of this was done before AI, by the way. This is all manually done, although I could certainly see a way that AI could augment this today. But then we went through and we edited the text heavily. Brendan kind of took the first pass and I said, hey, look for things that look maybe too political that we don't want in there, or things that are out of date or whatever, and kind of flag those, and I'll go through and look at them. We looked at the cases that were in here. We looked at the sections and, just kind of cleaned up a lot of things. And then we were able to put in some pretty cool content thanks to Mike Dayton. So he went and interviewed one of our state Supreme Court justices. That's not something that you would typically get in a textbook. And so he's got about an hour-long video with Justice McDermott talking about his background, how he got to the court, things like that. So really neat, intimate way for our students to meet a judge virtually that, they probably wouldn't get to. And the book as a whole, it was very serviceable as it was. Not a lot of terrific looking graphics, but we've kind of kept what's there. Um, and then we drop in other things. So I drop in a podcast from our Iowa Supreme Court about the Iowa and U.S. constitutions, the history of the difference of, and they can access that right here and listen to it, or they can link to it and download it on their phone. In a class that now has 750 plus people, I don't know how many are interested in doing a deep dive into these kind of things, but there's a handful. And I always hear from people that, hey, that was really neat. Like, I really enjoyed that podcast you put in there, things like that. So to the extent that there's some participation there, that's great. Another thing that has been really fun about this OER and the Pressbooks format is the opportunity to get students involved in my textbook, which is not something that I had really thought of beyond my research assistant. But because we can change things in this dynamically, it's a great way to get my students some writing experience and some credit and to make the book more relevant. So each year, and I haven't done it this year yet, I asked my teaching assistants to find maybe the 8 or 10 Supreme Court cases from the last year that are the most impactful. And I asked them to write up a little blurb, and we put it in this last chapter, Supreme Court updates. If there are things that change the law drastically, we also can go into the chapter and make that update. But most of the time, it's kind of an important, but not, doctrinal change in the law. So we can just kind of put updates here. It gives them a chance to do a little bit of low stakes writing to get a little, credit on their resume for doing this. I have links to SCOTUS blog for Supreme Court updates, and Michael Dayton's firm has Iowa updates there. But, we just have them do a couple paragraphs and we split it up by topic. This is also useful for the undergrad students who are in the class because I asked them to do a case memo and choose a case and write about it. And so they have a little template here already. Another way that I've gotten students involved or that they've asked to is I had a honor student, Michael. We do have one small section of the class that's an honor section limited to about 35. And he said, hey, I'd really like to do some kind of project where I write about an environmental law case. And I said, excellent. I said, what case would you like to look at? Do you have one? And he said, well, I think these Sackett cases are pretty interesting. And they're very important. So we talked about what would this look like, and I could have him write a paper, of course. But I said, why don't you write something up for the book? I'll give you credit. I'll edit it. I'll work with you on, going over things. And he said, yeah. So we have this really nice case update about these two important cases, and I'm able to give him credit for this. And I think he really likes, knowing that future students will read that. So that's been really cool. Other things that we've done, more interviews. So Mike Dayton was able to interview Tom Vilsack. If you guys are from Iowa, you know him. If you're from outside, you might not, but he was our governor. He's a lawyer. And Mike interviewed him when he was Secretary of Agriculture the second time. So I think I have the only textbook with a cabinet official with an interview in it, which is pretty cool. And again, my friend Mike and co-teacher has some really good connections. So this is in the chapter on administrative law. it's not an interesting topic. I just taught it the other day and I came in and I told the students like, most days I tell you how passionate I am about this topic and everything. Administrative law is something we're just going to get through. Um, but if you want to hear kind of what it is to work in an agency, you couldn't have a better source. And he actually Secretary Vilsack talked about growing up as an orphan and how he became a mayor and then a lawyer and all these other things. So very cool stuff with that. And then um, we had Rob Sand, who is now our state auditor, come and talk to the class several years ago about his time as Assistant Attorney General, and he cracked a lottery fraud case, which was just a huge case. And it was featured in the New York Times, and he has a book out about that. But that was kind of neat. And then a little further down, we had another friend and professor of mine talk about wrongful convictions. It's a few years old, but the information is still good. And again, these are just kind of, optional readings for folks. And then I try to put in things that might cause students to think more critically. I'm very careful that I don't push a particular viewpoint or anything other than this is what the law says. But I like to encourage them to think about is this justice? Is this ethical, even if it is legal? And so I get them into the Serial podcast, and season 3 has to do with a lot of people's stories in the criminal justice system in Cleveland. And the first one is a woman is assaulted at a bar, but she ends up in jail instead of the attacker. And it goes through what it's like to have an overworked public defender who doesn't have the resources to take your case. And why does she end up pleading guilty to something she didn't do? And then, we can have follow-up discussions about justice and equity and those kinds of things. Or if the person has no interest in that at all, they can go right past that. But I'm trying to reach learners in multiple places, trying to meet them where they are, because there is a percentage of people who are really, really into this class and they want more and they want richness. And then there's a large percentage of people who want to complete the class because it's required. And I understand both of those. Um, with this book, I think I can serve both populations, and they're saving collectively hundreds of thousands of dollars by not buying this outside book that retails for $360, or I saw now you can rent it for $58 for a semester. And I mean, that's not terrible, but free is much nicer. Um, and people can download this on their tablet, they can annotate it, they can download the whole thing as a PDF and take it with them. Um, I know I've spoken with some professors in the law school who have their OERs printed by Amazon on demand, and I haven't done that yet. I haven't had the demand for it, but it's something that I believe Pressbooks makes for a pretty easy conversion. Um, but I've just had a really positive experience with this and a really positive reception. The students seem to like it. We're able to make it available to them for free on day one, which is really important because our bookstores are kind of overcrowded. And when you have a really large class, there's always issues about books running out and can I get my book in time? Here it's literally you just open Canvas and it's right there. So I guess that's what I want to say about my book. It's been a really enjoyable process, and the university has really supported me through it, which is wonderful.
Great. Thanks so much, Andy. I wanted to mention too, at University of Iowa, I think your course is our biggest cost saver, or if not the biggest, one of the top two. Yeah, every year it's just like hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is amazing for our cost savings. So yeah, thanks to both of you for your presentation. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask our presenters? You can just feel free to unmute your mic or drop a question in the chat. Anyone? Okay, well, I have one question. So the reason we chose remixes today for a topic is that it tends to be kind of an overlooked way to develop OER. A lot of times authors will I think probably they may just not understand that, with open licensing, you can do different things with sources that you wouldn't normally be able to do with traditionally copyrighted resources. So you couldn't take and remix a traditionally copyrighted book. So I think people maybe just don't fully understand that. They might just want to, flex their own creativity and write something themselves. But I think what we saw from both of your presentations is that you are really taking apart these resources and aligning them with your course objectives and rebuilding them so that there's something that's really directly responsive to what you need for your courses. So I guess my question for both of you would be, how did you decide to do a remix rather than author something from scratch?
Well, I could go first. I think with mine, it was kind of time pressure because we lost the ability to use the existing book we had so quickly. And I knew I could plug in the existing book for about a year, but it really didn't align with my learning objectives and things. It was a stopgap measure. And I didn't think at that time in my career that I had the time or the bandwidth to write 15 chapters, just writing 2 chapters for the last book was a lot. Um, and so I looked in really quickly to the different licenses and saw that I was able to do it with that book. And I also contacted the author just to get his blessing, and he was enthusiastic and he said, "Yeah, by all means do it, and then share it with me because maybe I can change mine with some things that you've done."
Yeah, that's amazing. That's another kind of selling point, I guess, of OER is that, you're constantly making new iterations of it that you can share back with the author, and it just makes for a nice community of around certain topics.
Yeah, for me, anatomy, unlike law, is not a rapidly changing field. So if there's good resources out there, I mean, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's pretty straightforward. Here's what you need to know. This means this. Here's where this thing is. And so when I was looking through the OER, there was a lot of great stuff out there. Just, like maybe went a little bit too in depth or not enough in depth, or, this particular topic. And so I definitely didn't need to rewrite something that mostly already existed. And then also it just made it much more manageable for me because if I would have had to write a whole new lab manual, I probably would never do it. But here, knowing that I could draw from all these different things, it was pretty doable. I did it over the course of a summer. It was not hugely time intensive, and yeah, so we could get it done.
Great. Looks like we have a question from, let's see, from Peter. He says, what is the feedback that you get from students that are using your OER?
Do you want to go, Carly, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can.
Yeah.
I think fairly positive. I think again the subject level you can't complain too much about for anatomy just because here's what you need to know, here it is. And so I think the what is in the OER for the reference material, I think the students are perfectly happy with. I think they're very happy to be saving money. And I think the little book we have of the activities has been really great. So our course kind of did this weird flip where when we had the for-profit publishing manual, that actually didn't have the activities in it because you can't remix it. And so we had the activities as separate Word files that we actually had them download from Canvas and like do on their computers in class and submit. And that was terrible because it was just like this stress of students not getting it to submit in time and all that. And so when we were able to flip where the content was online, but then the activity book was paper, I like I hear from the TAs, the students stay much longer in class. They're much more engaged. They actually talk to each other and work as groups. And so I think it's been a real big benefit for our course.
For my course, it's kind of no news is good news on the book a lot of times because we got a lot of complaints about previous books, both the kind of the for-profit one that we put together, because it was only available printed in paper format and loose leaf, and we even got people who are like, "Why don't you bind this? Why don't you hole punch it?" And it's like, because I only have 700 students. This is all I'm of course, worried about. And then when I've used, commercial textbooks in the past, they're like, it's old, it's not relevant, it's expensive. And, when I started using this, the complaints kind of went away. I get maybe one or two comments a semester on the book, and they're always positive, and it usually has to do with the portability. They're like, I like that I can just pull this up and use this. So that's been a positive. I thought about one other reason I chose to remix rather than write. And so I have done some textbook writing for-profit publishers. And if you guys have done that, it's kind of awful in a lot of ways, in terms of there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of deadlines, there's a lot of busy work. But they also pretty much expect if you write a book that you're going to build an entire course, test bank, questions, quizzes, for every unit, slides, so that they can sell that as a whole, basically a package course to a professor at another school, who can use everything. And we're not allowed to get royalties on any books that we sell for our own classes. So that's not a revenue option for me. You do get paid usually by the textbook company to do those things. And if you catch on in another school, that's great. Then you can make some royalties. But that kind of takes it from writing a book to really, really designing and putting together a whole class that you then put into that for-profit world. And I had some ethical concerns about that as well. So another reason I remixed.
Are really good reasons. I had just a real kind of nuts and bolts quick question for you, Carly. So I noticed you had a lot of figures in your books. Did they all come from a single set or source, or did you just source them from all sorts of different places?
So, so with A&P, Anatomy and Physiology, there is kind of like one definitive book out there, OER book. It's Betts et al. And so most of the sources that I drew from were actually remixes of Betts in various ways. And so I either drew from the original source or the remixes. And so a lot of the figures are from that, from the Betts et al. Some of the figures were like when the other people remixed it, they made a couple figures that worked better for their course. And so I grabbed those figures. Some of them I just couldn't find something that I liked that was a good match for what I wanted. So I'd kind of do a deeper dive, like go to Wikimedia Commons. I asked Abby to help me a lot, our OER librarian. She could find some figures that like I didn't know existed. Some of them are taken from like more general bio textbooks because we do some kind of cellular type things that not all anatomy courses do. So yeah, it's a really wide range. Um, Also, we redesigned some of the figures, like we'd take the basic figure, but then relabel it for the structures that are important for our course. So the figures were really kind of the biggest lift, I would say, of the whole thing.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions from people, especially in biology, who want like a matching, like stylistically matching set of images. And we actually had one author who was working to create AI images, and that one's not quite done yet, but I'm very curious to see like how those turn out. Because it's true, somebody mentioned AI. I think we're starting to see a lot more use of AI in this space. Through Open Hawks, we had our first OER that was completely generated by AI this semester. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty comparable in some ways to what's been written by hand. So it's kind of interesting. All right, anybody else have any questions for our authors today? Well, I want to say a big thank you to both Andy and Carly for joining us today. This was super interesting. It's always great to hear about people's processes and just kind of the differences in the way people work with these things. So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to our guests, and we'll see you later.
Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having us.
much.
Bye.